I watched Marcus push his plate away with such force that it skidded across the mahogany dining table, stopping just short of our good china. The mashed potatoes I'd spent 40 minutes making, the way his mother always taught me, spilled onto the cream tablecloth in a pale, ugly smear. My stomach dropped, not because of the mess, because of what he said next, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is garbage, Ashley. Absolute garbage. Did you even try?" I felt my face flush hot. Around us, the silence at the table was suffocating. My mother-in-law, Karen, sat rigid in her chair, one eyebrow raised in that way she had. The way that made you feel like you'd just failed a test you didn't know you were taking. My sister-in-law, Jennifer, was suddenly very interested in her napkin. My dad, sitting to my left, had stopped mid-chew, his jaw working slowly as he processed what he'd just heard. It was Thanksgiving. Our dining room in the house we'd bought 3 years ago, the one Marcus and I had picked out together on a Sunday afternoon, the one I'd spent months decorating for this exact moment, had just become a courtroom. I need to back up. Because that moment, terrible as it was, wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the first domino. The real story started long before, in a place where everything felt solid and real and permanent. A place where I believed I had a marriage. 3 years earlier, things had been different. Marcus and I had met at Northwestern, both business majors, both ambitious in that hungry way that people in their 20s are when they believe the world owes them something just because they're smart and hardworking. He was tall, with dark eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and he had this confidence that made him seem like he had all the answers. I was drawn to it immediately. I was the girl who color-coded her planner and worried about everything, and he was the guy who shrugged and said things would work out. We'd dated for 6 years before he proposed. 6 years of building a life together, of learning each other's habits and fears, and the specific way we each took our coffee. By the time he got down on one knee at the Art Institute, a cliché, sure, but it was our cliché, I was so sure of him that I didn't even question it. I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. The wedding was beautiful. My mom cried. His dad made a speech that went on too long. We honeymooned in Costa Rica, where Marcus surprised me with a sunset catamaran cruise, and I felt like the luckiest woman alive. We came home to our first apartment together, a one-bedroom in Lincoln Square that was overpriced and too small, but ours. And we spent weekends buying furniture and painting walls and planning the future. 2 years into marriage, we bought the house. It was a gorgeous colonial revival in the suburbs, the kind of place that made you believe you'd made it. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a kitchen with stainless steel appliances, a backyard with mature oak trees. We'd scraped together every penny of our down payment, and I remember standing in the empty living room after we got the keys, just spinning around, unable to believe it was real. Marcus was doing well at his job. He was a senior consultant at a management firm downtown, making good money, the kind that allowed us to think about starting a family in a few years. I'd left the corporate world to freelance as a marketing consultant, which gave me flexibility but was less stable income-wise. We didn't fight about money, though. Marcus had always been the type to say it wasn't worth stressing about. "We're doing fine, babe," he'd say, kissing the top of my head when I'd worry about the mortgage. Stop overthinking everything. I filled the house with things that made it a home. I painted the guest bedroom a soft sage green. I hung family photos in the hallway. I spent a Saturday afternoon in the backyard, on my hands and knees, planting a garden. Marcus would come home from work and find me covered in dirt, and he'd laugh and pull me into his arms without even caring that I was filthy. Our marriage felt like the one thing in my life that was exactly as it should be. We had inside jokes. We had a rhythm. On Friday nights, we'd order takeout and watch movies on the couch, his arm around me, my head on his chest. We'd talk about kids, about maybe taking a trip to Europe next year, about whether we should get a dog. Everything felt possible. His mother, Karen, had never been particularly warm to me, but I'd accepted that years ago. She was a woman who'd been married to Marcus's father for 35 years, and she ran their household like a military operation. She had opinions about everything: the way I dressed, the way I decorated, the way I made casseroles. But she was his mother, and I loved him. So I swallowed my irritation and smiled and tried harder. That Thanksgiving last year, the one 3 days before the plate incident, everything had still felt normal. Marcus had spent the morning watching football while I prepped the turkey. Karen had arrived at noon with her signature green bean casserole and a comment about how I really should learn to make cornbread the traditional way. Jennifer and her husband Brad came with their 3-year-old Emma, who immediately destroyed the living room with her toys. My parents showed up with pie and wine. We sat around that same mahogany table, the one my grandmother had left me, and we passed dishes and laughed. Marcus carved the turkey like he'd been doing it his whole life. I remember watching him, feeling this swell of contentment. This is it, I thought. This is the life I built. This is everything I wanted. He reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. I didn't know then that things had already started to change. I didn't know that somewhere in the last 6 months, Marcus had started a side conversation with someone. I didn't know about the texts he was deleting before I could see them. I didn't know that he'd started staying at the office later, or that those late nights weren't actually at the office at all. I only knew that I loved him. I knew that I believed in us. And I knew that I was completely, utterly unprepared for what was coming. The week before this year's Thanksgiving, the one where he pushed his plate away, he'd been distant in a way I couldn't quite name. Not obviously cold, just somewhere else. His mind was somewhere else. When I'd asked him if everything was okay at work, he'd said fine. When I'd asked if he was stressed, he'd said no. He'd kissed me goodnight, but it felt like a habit, not a choice. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that everyone goes through phases in a marriage. I told myself that the flutter of anxiety in my stomach was just my natural tendency to overthink things, the same tendency Marcus was always teasing me about. I should have listened to that flutter. The day before Thanksgiving, Marcus came home and announced that his mother wanted to come over for dinner. Not just for dinner. She wanted to help. She wanted to be in the kitchen with me while I cooked. I remember feeling a small knot of dread at this news because cooking with Karen was like taking a test that you'd already failed before you started. But I smiled and said, "Of course. That would be lovely." He didn't meet my eyes when I said it. Now, on Thanksgiving Day itself, as I stood in my kitchen in my nice black slacks and the cream-colored sweater I'd carefully chosen, I was regretting everything. Karen had arrived early, and she'd already criticized my approach to the stuffing, the temperature of the oven, and the way I was chopping celery. "Not fine enough," she'd said, taking the knife from my hand. "Here, like this." I'd stepped back and let her take over, the way I always did, the way I'd learned to do. By the time everyone arrived and we sat down to eat, I was exhausted. I'd been up since 5 in the morning. I'd made 3 different sides from scratch. I'd set the table with cloth napkins and good silverware. I'd done everything right, or at least everything I thought was right. And then Marcus pushed his plate away. I looked at him across the table, trying to read his expression, trying to understand where this was coming from. His jaw was tight. There was a flush creeping up his neck. He looked angry. He looked like he was looking for a fight. "Marcus," I said quietly, aware of everyone watching. "The turkey took 6 hours. The potatoes—" "I don't care how long it took," he said, and his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. "It tastes like you made it without even thinking about it, like you were just going through the motions." My throat tightened. I could feel my mother watching me, could feel Jennifer's discomfort radiating across the table like heat. My dad had set down his fork entirely, his protective instincts clearly triggered. "That's not fair," I said, and I could hear the tremor in my voice, the one that came when I was trying not to cry. "I worked really hard on this meal." "Well, you should work harder," Marcus said. He reached for his wine glass and took a long drink. "Or maybe you should just let my mother cook. She actually knows what she's doing." Karen made a small noise. Not quite a laugh. Not quite something else. She was enjoying this. I could see it in the way her lips had curved up at the corners, in the way she was studiously looking at her plate like she wasn't part of what was happening. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. This wasn't about the potatoes. This was something else entirely. This was a man looking for an excuse to be cruel, and I had no idea why. I excused myself and went to the kitchen, closing the door behind me. I stood at the sink, my hands shaking, and I tried to breathe. Through the door, I could hear the murmur of conversation starting up again, the sound of my father asking someone to pass the gravy, the false normality of people trying to move past an uncomfortable moment. I caught my reflection in the window above the sink, a woman I didn't quite recognize, pale, shocked, fragile-looking in a way I'd never been before. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and waited for my heart to stop racing. But somewhere deep in my stomach, in that place where intuition lives, I knew that my life had just fundamentally shifted. That plate hadn't just been pushed away. It was a message, and I was only now beginning to understand that I'd been living in a story that had already started writing its ending without me. I had no idea what was coming, but I was about to find out that the man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, the man who'd promised to love me forever, was about to become someone I didn't recognize at all. I stayed in the kitchen for 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. My hands had stopped shaking, but my whole body felt hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything solid. I could hear them talking in the other room, the careful, polite conversation of people pretending nothing had happened. My dad's laugh, too loud and forced. Jennifer asking Emma about her preschool, the clink of silverware against plates. Life continuing, like my husband hadn't just humiliated me in front of everyone I loved. When I finally walked back in, I kept my eyes down. I didn't look at Marcus. I couldn't. If I looked at him, I'd either cry or say something I couldn't take back, and I was already terrified of what might come out of my mouth. My mom reached over and squeezed my hand. That small gesture of solidarity nearly broke me. Dinner ended shortly after. People sensed the wrongness in the air, the way animals sense a storm coming. My parents left first, my mom hugging me for longer than necessary, whispering, "You okay, honey?" I lied and said yes. Jennifer and Brad gathered Emma's scattered toys. Karen stood up with her purse and said something about how the meal was adequate, all things considered, which was her version of a compliment and also a knife twist. Marcus walked them to the door. He was cheerful with his sister, laughing at something Emma said. Like nothing had happened. When everyone was gone, I started clearing the table. I moved on autopilot, scraping plates, stacking dishes, wiping up the spill of mashed potatoes that had long since congealed into an unpleasant paste. Marcus came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching me. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked, not looking at him. My voice was steady, which surprised me. "What was what?" he said, and his tone was infuriating, casual, like we were discussing the weather. I turned to face him. "The way you spoke to me, in front of my parents, in front of your sister. That was cruel, Marcus. That was deliberately cruel." He looked at me for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. For a second, I thought he might apologize. I thought he might say it was stress from work, or he was feeling sick, or something that would explain this person I didn't recognize. Instead, he said, "Maybe you should try harder next time." I felt something inside me crack. Not snap, crack, like a thin line appearing in glass that would eventually spread. "I did try," I said quietly. "I tried very hard." "Well, it wasn't good enough," he said, and he turned and left the kitchen. I stood there with my hands in soapy water, staring at nothing. The thing was, I believed him. Not the part about the meal. The part about it not being good enough. Me not being good enough. I'd spent so many years trying to be the right wife, the right partner, the right person. And apparently, I'd still failed. That night, Marcus didn't come to bed. He stayed in his office, the door closed, light on under the gap. I lay in the dark for hours, listening to the silence of a house that suddenly felt very large. Around 3 in the morning, I finally fell into a shallow, troubled sleep. The next 2 weeks were strange. Marcus was polite, but distant. We moved around each other like roommates. He'd kiss me goodbye in the morning, ask about my day when he came home, but there was no warmth in it, no life. It was like he was an actor playing the role of my husband, hitting his marks, but not feeling anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that every marriage had rough patches, but that voice in my stomach, the one that had been trying to warn me, was getting louder. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, I found something. I was doing laundry, which was how these things always happened in movies, and I didn't expect my life to be like a movie. I was pulling clothes out of the dryer when Marcus's phone fell out of his gym shorts pocket. It landed on the tile floor with a dull thud. I picked it up automatically, not thinking, and that's when I saw the notification on the locked screen. Baby, I miss you. The sender's name was Contractors. My heart stopped. I held the phone for a moment, just staring at those words. My hands felt numb. I knew I should put it down. I knew that looking at his phone was a violation, that crossing this line would change things, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I tried his password. The first one I tried, our anniversary, worked. Marcus had never changed it. We'd never kept passwords secret from each other. That was how you did things when you trusted someone. The text thread was extensive. Hundreds of messages going back months. You're so much smarter than her. You actually get me. When are you going to leave? The photos made my stomach turn. I didn't look at them long. I didn't need to. The woman's name was Stephanie. She worked in his office. She was younger, I could tell from the photos, with blonde hair and the kind of effortless beauty that made women like me feel like we were trying too hard. There were screenshots of their dates, restaurants, hotels, a weekend trip to Milwaukee that Marcus had told me he was spending in the office on a consulting project. I sank onto the laundry room floor, the phone still in my hand. I was shaking so hard that I thought I might be sick. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This wasn't a mistake. This was a systematic, deliberate, long-term betrayal. He'd been living a double life. He'd been lying to my face every single day. My mind reeled back through the last year, trying to find where it had started. When had he stopped loving me? When had I become someone he needed to escape? How many times had he touched my face and thought about her? I must have sat there for an hour. When I finally got up, my legs felt strange, like they didn't belong to me. I put his phone back in the shorts pocket and finished the laundry like nothing had happened. I hung up his shirts. I folded his underwear. I did all the small, intimate tasks that wives do for their husbands, and I felt like I was moving through a dream. That night, Marcus came home at 7, which was unusual. He usually stayed late on Tuesdays. He seemed distracted when he arrived, checking his phone multiple times, typing responses. When I said hello, he kissed my cheek absently and disappeared into the office. I made dinner, nothing elaborate, just pasta and salad, and we ate in the kitchen. He didn't say much. I didn't either. What was there to say? That I knew? That I'd violated his privacy? That I'd seen evidence of a woman who was presumably everything I wasn't? After dinner, he showered and said he had work to do. He went back into the office. I sat on the couch in the dark living room and felt the weight of the truth settling over me like a blanket made of lead. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't even know how to begin. The person I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, the man who'd promised forever, was a stranger. And I had to figure out what that meant before I did anything else. What I didn't know, sitting there in the dark, was that confrontation wasn't going to be my choice. Events were already in motion. Things were about to happen that would strip away any remaining illusions I had about my marriage, about my husband, about the life I thought I'd built. The floor beneath me was about to disappear entirely, and I was going to have to learn how to fall without breaking. I didn't confront him that night. I spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of being a wife, while my mind spiraled through scenarios, each one worse than the last. I made breakfast. I went to the gym. I answered emails from clients. I was a ghost in my own life. On Friday morning, Marcus left for work as usual. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway, and then I called my dad. "I need to see a lawyer," I said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end. My dad had always been the practical one, the person who solved problems rather than talked about feelings. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "He's having an affair," I said, and hearing the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been before. "It's been going on for months. I have proof." My dad was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm coming over." He arrived 40 minutes later with his own attorney, Richard Chen, a man I'd met exactly once at a firm picnic. Richard was in his 50s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm that comes from having handled 1,000 divorces. They sat in my kitchen while I showed them the phone, the messages, the photos. Richard took notes. My dad just looked sad. "You're going to need documentation," Richard said. "Screenshots, dates, everything. Can you access his email?" I could. Marcus had never hidden his passwords because we'd never needed to hide things from each other. I spent the next 2 hours photographing everything, the text threads, the hotel receipts, the photos he'd kept in a hidden folder labeled insurance. The last one made me feel sick. Insurance against what? Against me leaving? "He's going to fight this," Richard said, reviewing what I'd gathered. "He has a good income, which means there will be a custody battle if you have children. But what you have here is clear infidelity and financial deception. The Milwaukee trip alone, he used marital assets for that without your knowledge. That's going to matter." I hadn't thought about custody. We didn't have kids. We'd been waiting, he'd said. We were going to start trying next year. The thought of what next year would have held made my stomach turn. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You document everything," Richard said. "You don't let him know you know. We file papers, and we serve him. He'll get angry. He might get uglier than he already is. But legally, we're in a strong position." After they left, I sat in my pristine kitchen in my beautiful house and felt the weight of what was about to happen. I was about to blow up my life. I was about to become the woman with the failed marriage, the woman who'd married a cheater, the woman who couldn't make it work. And everyone would know. My parents would know. His family would know. Everyone at the club would whisper about me. But he'd already made that choice. I was just finally choosing myself. That weekend, Marcus was distant in a new way. He was preoccupied, checking his phone constantly, stepping out of rooms to take calls. I wondered if Stephanie had told him something. I wondered if his guilt was finally catching up with him. I acted like nothing was wrong. I made dinner. I laughed at something he said. I was the best actress I'd ever been. On Monday morning, Richard had me sign the divorce papers. I stared at my signature for a long time before putting pen to paper. This was it. This was the moment I stopped being Mrs. Marcus Powell and became just Ashley again. "We're filing tomorrow," Richard said. "Once we do, there's no taking it back. Are you sure?" I was sure. I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Marcus was served with papers at his office on Tuesday afternoon. I knew this because Jennifer called me, panicked. She'd heard through the office grapevine that Marcus had been called into HR, that he'd come out white-faced and furious, and that he'd left the building immediately. He came home at 3 o'clock. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. He stood in the doorway, holding the papers, his face a mask of rage. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Divorce papers," I said calmly. "You'll want to contact your attorney. Richard Chen is my counsel. His contact information is in the documents." "You're serious," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "Completely," I replied. He looked at me like I was a stranger. "You can't do this." "I can, actually. And I am." He threw the papers on the floor. "You're going to regret this, Ashley. I'm going to take everything. The house, the car, everything. You're going to be left with nothing." I have documentation of your infidelity and financial misappropriation, I said, my voice steady as ice. I have text messages, hotel receipts, and testimony from my attorney that what you've done constitutes fraud. The house was purchased during our marriage with joint funds. You can't take it. You can take half of it, minus the value of what you spent on your girlfriend. Marcus's face went very red. You went through my phone? I did. That's illegal. What's illegal, I said, standing up, is committing adultery and spending marital assets on your mistress. What's illegal is the way you've treated me. You humiliated me in front of my family. You lied to my face every single day. And now you're going to face the consequences. He moved toward me, and for a moment I was genuinely afraid. But then he stopped, breathing hard. His hands clenched into fists. I want you out of this house, I continued. You have until Thursday to get your things and find somewhere else to live. If you're not gone by then, I'm calling the police. You're insane, he said. No, I replied. I'm finally sane. I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in years. And what I see clearly is that you're not worth my time or my energy. He left. He went upstairs, threw some things into a duffel bag, and left. I listened to his car pull out of the driveway, and I felt something inside me unlock. I'd been so afraid of his anger, so focused on managing his emotions and keeping him happy. And now that I'd finally stood up to him, I realized that his anger was just noise. It had no power over me unless I gave it power. Thursday came and went. Marcus didn't come back for the rest of his things. He sent his friend Derek to collect his belongings while I was at the gym, which was probably smart on his part. I came home to find half his closet empty, his desk cleared out, his books gone. The house felt different without his presence. Lighter. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. Richard was relentless. He deposed Stephanie, who turned out to be far less sympathetic than Marcus had probably hoped. She'd been fired from her job. Turns out the affair violated company policy, and she's bitter. She admitted to everything. She admitted that Marcus had told her he was going to leave me, that he'd said our marriage was over, that he'd promised her a future. She admitted that they'd spent thousands of dollars of what she assumed were his own funds on hotels and restaurants and weekends away. The judge was not sympathetic to Marcus. The judge was, in fact, remarkably unsympathetic. He ordered Marcus to pay me spousal support for the next 5 years. He awarded me the house. He split the retirement accounts 50-50, but because of the money Marcus had spent on Stephanie, there was a penalty. He ordered Marcus to pay my legal fees. When the judge read the settlement, Marcus actually laughed. It was an ugly, bitter sound that echoed through the courtroom. You think you've won, he said to me as we were leaving, but you haven't. You're alone now. You're going to be alone for the rest of your life because you're too much. You're too needy, too paranoid, too controlling. Stephanie was right about you. You're not worth the effort. I stopped walking. I turned to face him, and I saw, in that moment, exactly who he was. Not the man I'd married, not the man I'd loved, just a person who was angry because he'd been caught, because his lies had been exposed, because he'd finally faced a consequence for his actions. You know what? I said. I'm not going to waste another second on you. I'm not going to let your words hurt me. You don't get to do that anymore. You don't get to have power over how I feel about myself. I turned and walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun. My dad was waiting for me on the steps. He pulled me into a hug. You did good, kid, he said. You did real good. 6 months later, I signed the final divorce papers. I'd kept the house. I'd kept my business. I'd kept my sanity and my dignity and my sense of self. Marcus had moved to Milwaukee with Stephanie. They lasted 3 months before she left him for someone else. Apparently, he wasn't actually leaving his wife for anyone. He was just the kind of man who lied. I ran into Jennifer at the grocery store about a year after the divorce was finalized. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me. Ashley, she said, it's been so long. It has, I agreed. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly. For my mom. for not saying anything that Thanksgiving. I should have stood up for you. You were in an impossible position, I said, and I meant it. You were trying to keep peace in your family. Still, she said, I'm sorry. We talked for a few minutes, and it was polite and sad in the way that conversations between people from different chapters of your life often are. After she left, I stood in the produce section, holding a bag of organic kale, and I realized that I was okay. More than okay. I was actually happy. I'd started dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee with people who made me laugh and didn't make me feel like I was failing some invisible test. I'd redecorated the house, painting the living room a bold sage green and replacing Marcus's leather furniture with things that actually felt like me. I'd expanded my consulting business and hired an assistant. I'd taken up painting, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for because I was too busy trying to be the perfect wife. The truth is that Thanksgiving dinner, the one where Marcus pushed his plate away, was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was the moment he showed me who he really was. It was the moment everything changed. And sometimes, when I'm sitting on my couch in my beautiful house, drinking wine and reading a book that I chose, I think about that plate skidding across the mahogany table. I think about the mashed potatoes spilling onto the cream tablecloth. I think about the person I was that night. Frightened, uncertain, desperate to please a man who was never going to be pleased. And then I think about the person I am now. And I realize that the best revenge isn't about proving him wrong or showing him what he lost. It's about building a life so good, so full, so authentically yours, that you never even think about him anymore. It's about becoming someone so strong that their words can't touch you. It's about walking away from the table and never looking back. I survived Marcus Powell, but more importantly, I survived myself.